Hello there, welcome to another episode talking about the future of science and technology. Q&A about future of science and technology. Starting a bit late here, I'm afraid I'm in an intense phase as we try and get a rather innovative new product out. I've been doing product releases for software for 45 years now. And one of the features of innovative product releases is it's never completely calm and smooth because you're inventing things that have never been done before. And there's no procedure that just goes step by step to do that. And one's always finding things that are like, oh my gosh, we didn't think about this. And we're supposed to be releasing something soon. And so one's got to kind of scramble to figure it out. But that's my day job. This is relaxation here, at least for me, and I hope it's interesting and entertaining for you all. All right, let's see what questions we have here. Oh boy. Ilium comments. I read that recent developments in AI research are partly based on McCulloch and Pitts' famous paper on neural nets. Do you think there are more ideas worthwhile to explore again in cybernetics? Well, funny you should ask that. I'm actually just kind of very deep in trying to understand more about the history of neural nets. I got into this, well, I've been curious about it for a while, but I got into it most recently because I was trying to study the foundations of machine learning. And one of the things that sort of one of the things I was trying to do was to get sort of the minimal version of a machine learning system. And in a typical neural net system, you've got these pretty complicated setups with these artificial neurons, with these values and then these weights and the real numbers, and all the neurons are connected to each other. It's so complicated you can't even visualize what's going on because everything is sort of connected to everything. You can't lay it out in 2 dimensions. You can't look at kind of the values of the weights in an easy way, and so on. So I was trying to strip all of that out and find the minimal version of neural nets. And so I wrote this up recently. It came up with this very minimal version in which everything is discrete, everything is just laid out on a grid. And turns out, seems like you can learn just fine in a situation like that, where everything is just bits, not real numbers with all sorts of sort of floating point exact things with incremental changes and so on. You're able to do that. You're able to learn in that form. And so then I got wondering, well, where did we ever get the idea that neural nets would have to involve real numbers and calculus and all that kind of thing? So I went back and looked, and 1943 is kind of the big moment in neural nets, which was this paper by Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts called, let's see, I think a logical calculus for imminent behavior in, I forget, they called them nervous nets at that time. But that was sort of happening kind of sort of in the middle of the development of cybernetics. That relationship is a little complicated. I mean, McCulloch and Pitts knew about Turing's work from 1936. Electronic computers didn't really quite exist by 1943. So they were dealing with kind of more, they weren't really dealing with that idea yet. The thing that they really wanted to do was to associate what was then being seen as sort of the logical foundations of everything that particularly Whitehead and Russell had come up with in 1910 in their Principia Mathematica, in my opinion, kind of disastrously overblown kind of effort to develop mathematics from sort of pure logic. But the idea was that they were trying to figure out how brains would kind of could be doing logic. See, one of the things that was true in the history of all of this is there were sort of 2 parallel tracks. One were people doing anatomical dissections of brains and trying to figure out, what did this piece of brain do? And looking under microscopes and trying to figure out, are all the neurons in the brain a single connected thing, or are there separate neurons with little synapses in between? That was a big argument for a long time. a lot of things about kind of the physiology of the brain. And then separately, there was sort of essentially the philosophers who were saying, how does thought work? And sort of bringing those together was a non-trivial thing. And there started to be theories about how those might be brought together in the early 1800s. And in a sense, McCulloch and Pitts were kind of the next episode in that story of how to bring together what was something about what we know from the physiology of the brain with what we can conceptually think about how thinking might work. And in their world, thinking was about logic. And, George Boole had done his thing in the 1840s of developing Boolean algebra and so on, what he called the laws of thought. Then, as I say, in 1910, the kind of Principia Mathematica was like, and you can do math this way. So it's like everything sort of can be done with logic. And then the Turing machine was yet another sort of piece of evidence of this. So the question was, could you relate sort of neural net-like things to logic-like things? And that's what McCulloch and Pitts did. Now, interestingly, they seem to have really pretty much thought that everything was an all or nothing type proposition, that neurons were either firing or not firing, which is very discrete, very bit-like. And quite where the real numbers came in, I'm still a little bit trying to track it down. I mean, by 1949, John von Neumann, who was very kind of traditional mathy, was talking, he had a general and logical theory of automata, which was kind of taking off from the McCulloch and Pitts stuff. And it was through the McCulloch and Pitts stuff that von Neumann really got introduced to Turing machines and sort of brought the ideas of Turing machines into thinking about digital electronic computers. But exactly how all of that flowed through, I'm not yet completely sure. Hopefully I will figure it out real soon. I will say that there were other pieces of this picture that had to do with people with theories of learning. As I say, a lot of kind of psychology meets philosophy type theories. And then there was cybernetics. And cybernetics, gosh, it's a confusing story. I mean, the term cybernetics, which comes from the Greek word, well, I guess in Latin it's gubernator, the word for a helmsman of a ship, how you sort of steer and control the ship. In the Greek version is a kappa upsilon, starts with kappa upsilon, which in English becomes a CY, hence the cyber, etc. World. But confusingly enough, I just learned this recently, there was another term, cybernetica or cybernetics, that was being used by Ampere in the early 1800s as a thing that meant the control of a government, the control of a society. Norbert Wiener picked up that same name, cybernetics, to be sort of communication and control in sort of animals and machines, was his kind of sort of banner in that case. And I think, well, what were the ideas of cybernetics? It was all a bit complicated and confused. I mean, the focal point, I suppose, was these Macy conferences that happened in the 1950s, funded by the Macy's department store folk. And Norbert Wiener, Warren McCulloch, John von Neumann, these were all people involved with this. Margaret Mead was another person, anthropologist, another person involved with these. A whole bunch of people were involved. And they were talking about all sorts of things. I mean, to give you a sense of where it was going, it sort of got quite philosophical at some level. It got very neurophysiological at one level. It got very kind of machine kind of oriented, very mathematically oriented. I do remember that one of the articles that there is was entitled "Communication Between the Sane and the Insane," which who knows quite what that was. I mean, it's sort of I suppose it's a version of an alien communication story of, but in any case, it's and at the time, 1950s, kind of psychoanalysis and then psychiatry was sort of like big emerging sort of coolest fields in the universe type thing, and so quite a lot kind of revolved around ideas from that were sort of bubbling around in those disciplines. what came out? I mean, cybernetics spun out the very practical kind of methodology of control theory of how do you have a system like if you have a thermostat and it can either blow hot air or cold air, and you're trying to maintain your room at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, for example, you have to try and figure out what should the thermostat do. When should it blow hot air? When should it blow cold air? At 69 degrees, should it be blowing hot air or should it just hang out there and wait until it goes down to 65 degrees? How does it work? The idea of making controllers that don't just keep flapping on and off, hot, cold, but just sort of do the right thing. That is sort of the essence of control theory, is to do things like that. A common kind of thing, PID controllers that sort of integrate some of the history are a very common way to kind of smooth out those kinds of flapping type situations. But that was a piece that came out of control theory. Wiener had been sort of a classically trained mathematician, very keen to bring in sort of all kinds of Fourier analysis and all sorts of things like this. And that was a good match for the practicality of control theory that came out of cybernetics. This is in the 1950s to 1960s. Now, there was also, to some people, there was kind of a whole, what would now be called kind of complexity angle of, how do you get sort of things that are a bit like living systems and so on. That didn't get terribly far. I mean, I have to say, a big thing that those guys never understood, which I suppose is one of the things that I really, discovered and have talked a lot about. I found out about it, figured it out in the early 1980s, is this fact that even when you have a very simple set of rules, you can have very complicated behavior. That was something that was fundamentally unknown to the cyberneticians in the 1950s and 1960s and so on. And that was a sort of a core conceptual point that caused them to go off and build very, very complicated systems to do things when that really wasn't necessary. And it isn't what nature does either, but they didn't understand that point. So that was sort of a bit of a wrong turn there. Now, in cybernetics, there are a lot of other ideas that kind of got bundled in, like second order cybernetics is something where it's kind of the observed and the observer, and they're all put together. It's kind of reminiscent of some things I've been talking about in recent times with the Rouliad and all that kind of thing. I have to say, my attempts to truly understand what second order cybernetics was supposed to be about have not been terribly successful. And, cybernetics was a bit loosely knit and kind of flowed into a bunch of other areas. I mean, another area, there was a thing called general systems theory, which was more about, there was a person called Bertalanffy, who was a key figure in that. General systems theory was more talking about the structure of socioeconomic systems and so on, and almost what would now be perhaps almost called, mechanism design for economic systems and so on, and sort of the mechanics of how a large economic system works. I mean, that turned into things like the Club of Rome initiative in the 1960s to make this sort of giant model for the whole economy of the world, where everything is kind of flowing inputs and outputs and so on, and to be able to predict not just the economy, but the whole sort of behavior of the world, so to speak, a world model. And it wasn't terribly successful. In fact, I think in many ways it was sort of a disaster. And it also turned into things like the famous Project CyberSyn, which was a project done in Chile during a particular regime there. The idea was to have a full control of the country. And they had this kind of control room that looked very much like the bridge of the Starship Enterprise in Star Trek, so to speak, even with the same kind of chairs, more or less. And the idea was they'd have all these screens showing, factory output and so on in different parts of Chile, and they'd just be able to sort of press buttons and control the country. Well, it never really got deployed, and the regime was overthrown before it came to pass. But that was the kind of thing that people were thinking about in sort of the cybernetics meets society kind of mode. So I don't know what things there are from cybernetics that one could make use of. I mean, it's worth realizing that reinforcement learning which has been big and important in LLMs and things like this, where your reinforcement learning is like you are giving, well, a particularly common case these days is reinforcement learning with human feedback, where it's like, okay, human, what do you think of this output? Oh, I think it's terrible. That goes back into the system as a thing that you learn from. The system keeps on producing things and then testing them against, it could be testing them against the real world, or it could be testing them against a human saying, what do you think of this? And that idea of sort of that feedback mechanism, that idea is a very cybernetic idea. And in fact, in control theory, there is the theory of feedback control is really extremely similar to the theory of reinforcement learning. And in fact, there's pretty much a parallel vocabulary in those two fields that it's just that the vocabulary is different, but it maps onto each other. So I'm not sure what all one can learn from that. I think it is interesting that back in the sort of pre-cybernetics era, there was also a lot of connection between linguistics, psychology, philosophy, and so on. And I don't know what one can learn from that. I mean, a lot was written. It was a period of great hope that, finally one had sort of cracked how brains worked. One will be able to automate brain work as one can automate mechanical work with, bulldozers and things. It is kind of an interesting piece of history that, in a sense, all of the details of, oh, we should do it exactly this way, and this really matters, and that really matters. Turns out everybody was right with all the different choices. Oh, this was important, that was important. Because it turns out this is sort of a consequence of, well, my kind of principle of computational equivalence, that in the end, all these systems are capable of doing the same kinds of computations. So it doesn't really matter whether you have a neural net that has precisely this details or that details or whatever. Now, it may matter a lot in terms of practical implementation. It may be a big deal that you do or don't need this particular kind of GPU chip to actually implement your machine learning. But from a theoretical point of view, all of these kind of debates about, oh, should you do it this way or should you do it that way? Everybody was right in some sense. But one didn't know that for 80 years. And I think it's a funny story, and I'm trying to learn more about it now. Let's see. Nata asks, what is the future of technology about speech recognition? Speech recognition seems like it's kind of a solved problem at this point. I mean, there are still a few cases which are tricky, like the kind of cocktail party problem of many people are speaking and you really want to be paying attention only to one person. But there's a bunch of technology that's been developed even for that case. It's a lot easier in that case if you have multiple microphones. I mean, we have, two ears, and that helps us a bit. But, if you're prepared to sort of put microphones around a room, then you can really pretty much nail that problem, I think, at this point. And in terms of the pure, oh, I'm paying attention to this one thread of conversation, I'm recognizing this one voice that has a particular voice timbre, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It seems like we're just on the cusp of that really being pretty much a solved problem for machines. And I have to say, it's going to be a weird thing. People are going to start wearing their little AirPods or whatever when they're in sort of a cocktail party setting, because it will just be easier to have conversations with people if you can let your computer basically, or your phone or whatever, do the enhanced listening that you need. And even if it's really noisy, and even if it really is straining for you as a human to hear, there will come a point when these automated systems are better than us humans at being able to sort of distinguish the cocktail party thing. I was just noticing yesterday, there was a kind of where I am on the east coast of the US, there were some northern lights that you could see. And it was like, okay, I'm just going to go outside and let my eyes dark it out for a bit and try and see this. And actually, I pull up my, very recent model phone and I hold it up, and it's got a better image than I can see. So this is kind of the moment where we are kind of things like the image you can see of the northern lights is better on your phone than it is in your eyes. And I think the same thing will be true with this kind of noisy environment listening type thing as well. it was the transition over the decade or so, a couple of decades, that sort of voice recognition has been coming in, has been interesting. I mean, I have, as you can hear, kind of still have a sort of British-like accent. And for a long time, voice recognition systems just didn't understand me. Um, and then eventually they started to, and when the whole sort of wave of machine learning based end-to-end voice recognition came in, it got better. The amount of training data is now huge, and it's pretty much a solved problem. The thing I always notice is sometimes you're talking to your phone or something and you have to just say one word. It doesn't do a very good job on that. So long as it's got, if you can pad it out, it'll do a much better job. So long as it's got some context of the kind of way you're talking, it's going to do a much better job. I think another thing that is coming, it hasn't really quite come yet, is, well, if you're using something like Zoom or Teams or whatever, the system always knows who's talking because it always knows which microphone is generating input. So it can always, when it's diarizing the thing, when it's producing a diary of what was said, it always knows, oh, so-and-so was talking at this time, so-and-so was talking at that time, and it can say that. But there's sort of another challenge is in sort of a free, open situation where just a bunch of people are talking in a room and there are no sort of separate microphones for each person. Is it possible to tell just from the voice who's talking? And yeah, it kind of is. When people talk on top of each other, how does that work? I'm actually not sure how things like Zoom handle that. I haven't really looked at I'm in plenty of meetings where people are talking on top of each other. I don't know whether it's listening separately to each microphone and sort of gets all of the input or whether it just gets confused. But that's another thing where, when the humans aren't confused, it should be possible to make the machine not confused. Even when the humans are confused, there may be times when we can get kind of enhanced listening from the machine. I think the issue of generating voices is again something that's really, just in the last year has started to be pretty firmly solved, and that's I think sort of the thing that's coming. It's been there in some form for a few years, but the thing that is about to be, I think, quite routine is real-time video conferencing with language translation, and where you can be talking to somebody completely fluidly, where you're each talking a different language and it's getting translated in real time with the same kind of voice intonations and so on. I mean, it'll be kind of interesting to see the kind of cultural translation because there are obviously tonal languages that aren't tonal. There are cases where, you in English, you kind of go up in pitch at the end of a sentence, things like that. In other languages, you don't. It'll be interesting to see what the kind of cultural translation looks like and whether, in fact, there's a whole separate layer that's needed beyond translating the words. Do you need to kind of culturally translate? And then you get into the very complicated issue of, let's say that in some situation, there are gestures that are, well, for example, a very, very common one is, in Indian cultures, for example, it's pretty common that what in sort of the typical Western culture is you nod your head to say yes. In Indian cultures, you can shake your head to say yes. And the question would be, if you're doing, if you're translating from Hindi or from one of the hundreds of other Indian languages to English, do you also change the head, because it'll look very strange to somebody who only knows English, let's say, in traditional, US customs or something. It'll look very strange if you're talking to somebody and they're agreeing with you, but they're shaking their head. And so then it raises the question, should the AI change that head motion into a nodding of the head to do cultural translation as well as language translation? Very slippery and dangerous slope, because it's kind of like, where does that end in terms of what you translate? And you could even imagine something where it's kind of, you could imagine other kinds of things. Like, for example, you could give some elaborate explanation that's at a very sophisticated level, and the AI could dumb it down to give a sort of simplified version. And at some point, the AI is pretty much in charge of what's being said. it kind of reminds me of something in the history of language translation. Early 1960s, people thought computers are going to do everything. Cybernetics is raging forward, and it's all going to work great. And height of the Cold War, everybody's worried about what happens if the red telephone gets picked up, and at one end of the phone they're saying, no, we'll take down our missiles or whatever, and then the translation of that to Russian or whatever is, we hate you guys, we're going to blow you up. And that then, World War III starts up as a result of that misunderstanding. Kind of one of the ideas was, let's have machines do that translation instead of humans, because the machines won't be biased. The machines will be kind of just do the straight translation. There'll be no possibility of some, terrible kind of espionage story of the interpreter, the translator was really a spy or something like this. Let's just have the machines do it. They'll always do the right thing. Now, of course, we've learnt that the machines don't necessarily always do the right thing, and that it's a complicated story training the machines and so on. But it's kind of an interesting feature and irony. But if we start getting into a situation where we're doing things like cultural translation in, I can imagine other things like for example, in cultural translation, one could certainly imagine things which in one culture are a compliment, in another culture are a horrifying insult. I can think of one's examples of that. And what do you do if you're doing translation in real time with an AI? How do you translate those things? What do you do? Or do you get some weird, crazy thing where you're saying, and I think blah, 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 and up comes an alert that says, warning, in Japanese culture, this will be read as an insult type thing. Or does the AI just sort of smooth it over for you? Interesting questions. I think in the challenging. Let's see. Let's see. Yeah, Houston asks, how do I know if I'm speaking to a human? The future is crazy. Yeah, well, the future somehow is always crazy, but this whole question about is it a human at the other end of the whatever, it's an interesting issue. I mean, people try to have a variety of methods, whether it's filling out captures, whether it's doing iris scans, whether it's checking that there's blood flow in the fingerprint and so on, to check that it's really a human. I suspect that is a losing proposition. I mean, there are lots of situations where it's like, is that really a person there? The system says, look to the left, look to the right. In time, that will be doable automatically. And I think the only real way to know that what's there is what you think is there will be some kind of context, some kind of, chain of validation. It is ironic that in the sort of standard arc of history always repeats itself. I know when I was a kid and people were doing international business, that was kind of a big deal to be doing sort of international business, importing and exporting things from different parts of the world and so on. It was, how did you do it? You were buying something from some place in, Peru or something, and how did you know that you were really going to get what you thought you were going to get? And how did you have confidence in the supplier that you send the money and they send the thing, or they send the thing before they get the money or whatever else? And so there were all of these complicated mechanisms of letters of credit and all these things where you would have essentially these chains of trust, sort of trust chains of, oh yes, my bank, which is a reputable bank in England or whatever, will communicate with this bank in the US, which will communicate with this bank in Mexico, which will communicate with this bank in wherever, and everybody sort of trusts everybody on the chain. That was sort of before banking was internationalized and so on. That was how things worked. And it is kind of interesting that we are to some extent probably going to go back to a situation where these kinds of trust chains become important if we really want to know that you have what you thought you have. And I mean, it's true already, like on the web, whenever you use an HTTPS website, that is making use of a certificate authority where it's kind of as your browser is connecting and so on, you're confirming that you're talking to who you thought you were talking to. And that's done by having a small number of kind of centralized, trusted certificate authorities that that have the information that can validate that you're really talking to the website you thought you were talking to, not some sort of website in the middle that's pretending to be the website you were talking to, but it's actually going to steal all your data. So I think it's an interesting question how this sort of I'm really talking to a human type thing is going to evolve. I think it will evolve more in these kind of trust chains than it will in the, oh yes, if you can blink your eyes on demand, then you're a human type thing. I think that it'll be a long time before one is in the science fiction world of the face-to-face encounter with a human being not knowing whether it's really a human. I think with video conferencing, I think it's going to be quite a while before there is a serious question when you're talking to that image of the human, whether that's really a human. Part of the reason for that is that we humans have incredibly good sort of feature detectors for things about human faces and so on. We're very sensitive to features of human faces. I mean, it's if you asked about, I don't know, some animal face, we'd be a lot less sensitive. But for human faces, we're really well tuned for that. And we can pick up all these microfacial, motions and so on. I'm not sure that we could consciously explain, oh, what's wrong with the way this person is reacting. Sometimes one can tell, people who have various kinds of physiological issues, neurological issues, and so on, you can see something is wrong. The reaction isn't what you would expect, but you can't necessarily verbalize what it is. But I think we have a pretty, we're extremely well tuned to recognize the details of human faces and so on. So my guess is that's not a thing where we'll be in doubt anytime soon. Let's see. Oh boy, so many questions here. Well, Tori is asking about the future of finance. Talk about AI, talking to AI for trading. Well, I mean, finance is already very AI based in the sense that, a large fraction of all of the trades that are made on stocks, options, commodities, whatever else, they're done by programs. They're not done by humans. Some of those trades are made in matters of milliseconds, much faster than a human could do it. I mean, there are all sorts of high frequency trading systems that are kind of watching for that little tiny effect where you can kind of sort of get an advantage by going through this sequence of different different trades and so on. I mean, I remember, to give a sense of this, back in the, 1980s, had a friend who was doing currency trading, and they briefly found that there was a chain of like 8 currencies that you could convert from this to this to this to this. And, as you went around the whole loop, you'd make money. And they put through, I don't know how much, tens of millions of dollars or something in a matter of, I don't know, 15 minutes, something like that. And that was when the loop closed up. My impression is these things close up much more quickly today, partly because it isn't a human making the decision to do those trades. It's an automated system that's noticed these things and that's doing them. So, one of the things that sort of one imagines is that as all these systems are looking for these minor cases where things don't quite match and trading on them, that they're kind of closing up those places where things don't match, and and that's sort of making things more efficient. I mean, famously, the the hedge fund associated with the doomed FTX enterprise was, at least I think, that's what I remember people saying long ago, was that they were using the fact that cryptocurrency prices on exchanges which were doing conversion from cryptocurrencies to regular fiat currencies, that the prices would be different on the Tokyo exchange versus an exchange in Japan versus an exchange in the US versus whatever else. And if you can see those changes, you can be doing trades that that make use of those changes to get ahead, so to speak. The thing to realize is that sort of part of the dynamics of the market is, unless you have incredibly efficient trading mechanisms with incredibly small commissions and things like this, you really won't get ahead by noticing a 0.1%, effect. You have to have a giant, extremely expensive to build infrastructure in order to take advantage of these very minor changes. Now, I have to say, one of the things that I don't think I understand very well in the world is it is certainly the case that an awful lot of the best and the brightest go into finance in the modern world. And the question is, at some level, it's, oh my gosh, what's happening to the world? Why aren't more people actually sort of, quotes, doing real things? Well, it's complicated what that means, because back in the day, people mostly grew their own food. People did sort of the whole stack of things you need to survive, so to speak. But increasingly, sort of that was delegated away. And, most of us, I spend my time, typing at a computer and doing this and that and the other, and not worrying about kind of, the details of how my food is getting grown. And so, so it sort of ascended to a level of abstraction in dealing with the world. And one could say, well, sort of this finance layer is just another layer of abstraction about the world. I mean, it's always kind of a funny thing to realize there are all these people doing all these trades and so on. And, there comes a level of quantitative trading when people have no idea what the companies that they are trading have actually do. It's like, it's just a ticker symbol to me. And I have no idea whether it makes bricks or computers or milk or whatever. It's just this ticker symbol. Or even beyond that, it's just this sort of this element of this algorithm that might pick up a ticker symbol that's this because that fits in the right way in this algorithmic process that it's doing. So it's kind of a higher level abstraction of dealing with the world. Of course, one wonders in the end, somebody has to be in those companies doing that work and, making the companies valuable or less valuable or whatever else. Now, of course, at some level, somebody has to be growing the food. What has happened is the growing of the food, so to speak, has become more and more automated. I mean, back in the early days of the US, for example, if you look at sort of the pie chart of what people were doing, 80-something% of people were engaged in agriculture. And that fraction has shrunk to something quite tiny, but in modern times, as a result of all sorts of automation, not only at the level of big machines, but also at the level of things like fertilizers and seeds and so on. And things where you are, for better or worse, essentially manufacturing the food rather than growing it. But in any case, the main point there is the thing which used to be something a lot of people had to do got automated. Now, at this point, there's still, in tech companies or whatever else, there's people like me actually doing work, real work to kind of generate value and things like this. And it feels like a little bit of kind of a, what's the world coming to if a lot of people are engaged in the kind of higher abstraction level of let's just trade companies and let's just sort of manipulate the financial layer of the world. I guess I don't completely understand that yet. I don't understand whether it's a story where people might say in the past, oh, you're not leading a real life unless you're growing your own food. And where I tend to feel you're not sort of leading a real life unless you're actually making stuff, but that's a personal prejudice, so to speak. And it's kind of, what does it look like in a world where all there is people, let's say, doing quantitative finance, and even at that point, does it even need humans to do that? At what point is that all automated? And a thing that certainly is very obvious to me as producing mathematical morphem language and so on, our tools are pretty universally used by quantitative, quant finance companies and so on. It's always a bit frustrating to us because those companies are tiny. They have very talented people, but they don't have very many of them. They might be 50 people, a few hundred people, but they'll be trading billions of dollars. And it's kind of concentrating for us, for example, since we make a living by selling, Wolfram language and so on to people, and our sort of way of doing that is to say, you buy it for yourself, it costs X amount of money per year or whatever. But if it turns out that those 50 people or something, that's just 50 people buying something, that's not very many, considering that they're operating a business that's churning through hundreds of billions of dollars every year, for example. So, but it's really a notable thing that these companies are lots of machines and not necessarily very many people. And kind of what that means more globally, the fact that there's this kind of layer of abstraction in the world of kind of sort of the finance layer. I'll give you an example, actually, from farming. I seem to remember my data might be slightly out of date on this, that the typical US farmer is sort of getting half their money from actually selling stuff that they make and grow, and half their money from commodities trading. That half of that they're having to think about, oh, I'm going to make have a harvest this year. It's going to be good. It's going to be bad. I've got to hedge against the possibility of a bad harvest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that in the end, some fraction of what they make to make a living is coming from commodities trading, not from actually growing food, for example. And I think, I don't think I fully understand what it means when there's sort of a layer of the world that is abstracted like that. I also don't know what it quite means, as you get to higher and higher levels of abstraction in the world of finance. I mean, at one point, people are buying and selling stocks, buying and selling stakes in companies. Then they're buying and selling options that are sort of, contracts to, in the future, buy stock in this company at a certain price, and you pay a certain amount for the right to be able to do that at a certain time in the future. And then you're doing things where you aggregate those together, and things where you have all kinds of different contingent sort of, where you're building essentially all these different and essential financial organisms, where there's this sort of ecosystem of financial products, and it's kind of like in biology, where eventually there's sort of the organism that is the Bermudan option with I don't know what, all kinds of different detailed structures and so on. I mean, by the way, this is an area where each one of these things is basically a contract. Like, for example, a futures contract on some commodity says, I will buy these, or I have the right to sell these pork bellies at some point in the future for this price, and I'm paying this amount for that right. But that thing that defines that is a contract, but that contract has become very standardized. So it is sort of an algorithmic contract. It's something that can easily be made computable. Something that hasn't happened in the world of finance is to make computable all contracts. People are finally now trying to do that for mortgages. That was not done during the mortgage crisis, for example. The typical mortgage was a couple of page or more document, and people didn't really know what those documents contained. And so knowing, oh, if this and this and this happens, what will happen to all these mortgages, particularly floating rate kind of mortgages, and so on, what will happen to all these things? It wasn't very clear because people didn't really know what these contracts contained. One of the things that's certainly coming is everything being a kind of computational contract, where one is representing, not in legalese, but in code, the provisions of the contract. that's something which people sort of think about quite a bit in terms of smart contracts executed on blockchains, but mostly those are really the focus there is on make it be that the blockchain is verifying that this contract is executed the way it was supposed to be executed. I think the bigger challenge is to take that multi-page mortgage document and turn it into something where it is represented as kind of code that is unambiguous. And certainly that's something where Wolfram language is kind of the leading contender for a way to actually represent things in the world computationally. And so it's something I've thought about a bit, and we've done some work on, and we've worked with various organizations on to develop kind of computational contracts for things. And I think that's a thing that will happen in quantitative finance and so on. More and more things will become tradable because they are defined by computational contracts. I think the thing to understand is people say, oh, machine learning is going to revolutionize trading. I think the thing to realize is every sophisticated quantitative hedge fund type place has been doing various versions of machine learning for decades. This is not new news. I think the thing that is often very important in those situations is that they have good curated data about the history. I mean, one of the things that is very typical of quantitative finance is to use the fact that history does in fact repeat. That if something happened in the 1930s and you know exactly what happened in this cascade of stock prices and so on, that the chances are something somewhat similar will happen to today. And so, just being able to use essentially regression standards statistics from the 1930s, actually, to analyze kind of what's happening today, compare it to what happened before, even that is already an important thing. And one might call that machine learning, or one might just call that statistics. But those kinds of methods, and there are different quant hedge funds have used different kinds of methods, but in the end, it has been very AI oriented for a very long time. And I don't think anything particularly dramatic has happened. I mean, I know a number of people who have started kind of, the LLM based hedge fund. I don't think there's any great drama there. I think the only thing that is, everybody's tried to do, and people have been doing this for a while, is reading narrative documents that are in natural language and being able to somehow make them computable or extract sentiment or beyond sentiment from those things. I mean, it's worth just remembering that in the pursuit of money, so to speak, many things are done, and people do, there are satellites flying whose primary purpose is kind of looking at things on the Earth to be able to predict more about, let's say, agricultural yields or success of retail stores based on how many cars are in their parking lots, or other kinds of things that are solely being done for the sake of kind of this layer of the world that is kind of the quant finance layer of the world. But as I say, I feel it's something I don't really understand. How this ends. Is it the transition from grow your own food to kind of live in a world where that's sort of, for many people, more or less taken care of, and you're doing sort of a higher level of intellectual thinking or whatever? Is this another level of that, or is this something different? And it's on my kind of list personally to understand more about economics. Maybe I'll be able to talk about that more in a few months. I'm currently very stuck on biology because I've been making a lot of progress in biology and using methods that come out of our physics project and things like this. And sort of next up, after I feel like I've picked the low-hanging fruit from biology, is probably going to be economics. Let's see. Oh boy. So many questions here. Well, better say getting an AI to understand economics seems like a big step. I mean, I think, yeah, there's sort of the whole question of what can an AI do in sort of what would it even mean for an AI to understand economics? What would it mean if you said, here is all the economic data that we have. Tell me sort of what actions to take based on that, or if I'm a government, tell me how to, move the levers that governments have to control, interest rates from central banks or whatever else, in order to achieve this or that. I think it's an interesting question whether, even though, so it's a fair question. Getting a theory of economics has been really hard. There are, a lot of the theories are quite qualitative, even though they pretend to be quite mathematical, and they're often quite confused by, are they really mathematical theories that are like laws of physics, where mathematics really works, or are they more like, if that goes up, this will go down? In biology, there tends to be rather little theory. And in sort of the practice of medicine, there might be a chart that says, if this goes up, then that will go down. In economics, people have the intuition, if this goes up, that will go down. But as you try to mathematicize that, it has been quite difficult to do that in economics, and as it has been in medicine, for example. And there's sort of a question of, maybe it's the case that even though you can't mathematicize it, you can do something else with it. You can certainly, there's been a long history, and people have used a lot of work that I've done to make sort of computational models of things in economics with some degree of success. I think some of the kind of, why does this happen? Why does this phenomenon happen? One's been able to get much better intuition by using kind of computational models, but it's not going to tell you, the price of gold is going to be exactly this. It's going to tell you roughly, here's a phenomenon that happens that is the result of this other thing. You'll be able to get some rough narrative from it. But an interesting question is there a possibility of kind of black box economics where it's just like, ask the LLM and it'll say, yeah, I think the price of gold's going to go up, or whatever else it is. And if you say, why do you think that? It probably will have sort of no idea. It's just something that came out of its machinations, its machine learning, so to speak, produced that. And could it be the case that a field like economics could have a predictive theory, even though in a sense it has no theory? That there's no narrative theory where you can explain what's going on, but nevertheless there can be predictions about what will happen. It's sort of interesting that in a sense it is what's happened in quantitative finance. You ask people who do that, why does such and such a thing happen? Like many times I've asked people, give me a fundamental explanation for why the market prices tend to bounce around seemingly randomly. And in the end, most people who do quantitative finance pretty much say, look, we don't really care. What we care about is making predictions that we can trade from, not the foundational science of that. Other people say things like, well, if they didn't bounce around randomly, then you'd be able to make money from predicting how they bounced around. But of course, that's what quantitative finance is all about, is making enough of a prediction that you can make money from it. So, and people will make statements like, the market is efficient, all people who are trading in the market are rational, all of which are clearly not correct. And but how you kind of tease out what is correct from that is not very clear. And as I say, it's a is there a possibility that things could be predictable but not explainable? Possibly, yes. I'm not sure. That's an interesting possibility. There's a question here from 5 asking, what's the difference between a computational and a mathematical model? Well, I think the main point is, in a mathematical model, you say, I've got this formula. It describes what's going to happen in a system. I work out the formula. I know what the system is going to do. In a computational model, you say, I have these rules for how the system will operate. And to know what the system is going to do, I'm going to run these rules and see what they do. So it's a little different from saying, I've got this formula and it tells me everything, and I just have to evaluate this formula appropriately. And that way I can know what the system does, versus I'm at the starting gate. I've got these rules, and then I'm going to play out those rules and see what they imply, and then compare those to the system. I think the real thing that distinguishes these two approaches is this phenomenon that I found 40 years ago now called computational irreducibility. This idea that even though you know the rules for a system, that doesn't immediately tell you what the system is going to do. You have to do the irreducible computation to find out what those rules imply, to see what the system will do. Whereas in mathematics, you at least have the concept, although it doesn't always quite work this way, that it's like you've got the answer now. You know the formula, you know the equation, now you know how the system will behave. Whereas in the computational case, you know the rules, you have to run the rules to find out what will happen. So that's I think, the big distinction. There's a question here about self-replicating programs. That's kind of an old story. It's John von Neumann back in 1954, maybe, two perhaps. He kind of came up with his version of cellular automata as a kind of an idealization. First, he had the idea, the key thing about biology is that biological organisms can reproduce themselves. He said, well, how do they do that? Maybe they're like chemical factories, and the chemical factory is building another chemical factory. And then progressively over the course of a little while, I think Oscar Morgenstern, an economist, kind of suggested to von Neumann, maybe you can do things with a slightly more idealized version of that. And then Stan Ulam, who'd been studying infinite matrices, said maybe you can just do that in a two-dimensional grid. Anyway, John von Neumann ended up with this idea that he could use kind of these discrete elements to make a potential model of a self-reproducing system. And he did that in 1952, I think, was finished off by a chap called Arthur Burks after von Neumann died. And it led to a book called Theory of Self-Reproducing Automata. In a sense, that book is crazy, because what it does is it constructs in this very step-by-step way this unbelievably complicated system that does a comparatively simple thing of reproducing itself. Now, some people will make a big deal out of the fact that, in a sense, that book, which was done before the function of DNA was figured out in 1953, was kind of, in a sense, sort of predicted the idea that you would have some programmatic specification by which you build an organism. And that's something which plays out in the case of DNA as well. But the thing that was very intuitionally wrong was von Neumann absolutely did not know this point about the fact that you could have a simple rule that did complicated things. He fundamentally did not know that. One can tell that from his writings. I know that from talking to people who knew him. He really didn't have that intuition. That was an intuition that, as I say, I think I was primarily responsible for introducing in the early 1980s as a result of actually being able to do a bunch of computer experiments and seeing things that I didn't expect. But once you see them, you kind of realize after a while that that's just kind of the way things work. So there was that origin. There were the idea that you can sort of digitally make something that reproduces itself had many tentacles after that. I mean, the 1980s, there started to be computer viruses, computer worms, which were essentially self-reproducing pieces of code. Then there was a bunch of effort in doing modeling of essentially biological evolution and ecosystems based on sort of code-like things. And people were making sort of semi-realistic machine code that sort of did things that were kind of like what was that sort of had biological-like features. I have to say, I wasn't that impressed with those things, because somehow the phenomena of biology are, there are definite phenomena about the way that coevolution works for different organisms and things like this. But there's a fairly thin set of phenomena that are really to explain. And by the time you make these models that have a gazillion parameters and a gazillion sort of bells and whistles in them, it's kind of like, and out of it comes this small amount of stuff. And in a sense, sometimes I remember there was one model of the rainforest, which just had all the stuff in it. And it's like, well, yes, the model behaves like the rainforest because it really is. It has all the same mechanisms in it. It's not surprising. You're not learning something sort of foundational about the way that biology works to be able to see that. You're just saying the mechanisms which we already know are there, so to speak. We're reproducing those mechanisms and seeing the same thing. I think my low point of those kinds of things was sometime in the mid 1980s, excuse me. But I was at some conference about artificial life, and there was somebody who had a model of an artificial fish, and the thing was swimming back and forth in its artificial tank, and it was like, okay, what's this model? Oh, the person says the model has 90 parameters or something. And my first response was, well, then you could have an elephant walking up and down, because with 90 parameters, you can describe anything. And it's kind of like, so what do you learn from your 90 parameter artificial fish? The question is, well, what's the question? What would you like to learn about the artificial fish? And then what do you get from this model? I mean, the thing in science and doing modeling, the key story is usually the most powerful models are the models where the least goes in and the greatest comes out. And that's, for example, in our physics project, that's the thing that's just absolutely amazing to me about that project, is how incredibly little goes in and how much comes out. A second thing is you always know you're kind of on a losing streak when, as you see what the consequences of the model are, and then you compare them, you say, well, that doesn't quite fit, so let me tweak the model a bit. That doesn't quite fit, let me tweak the model. That's never a good sign. The thing that's sort of amazing about our physics project is, while it's hard to work out the consequences for, all sorts of details of physics, so far, nothing has had that property that, oh, we have to go back and say, oh, we got to tweak the model to explain what's going on here, which is amazing. And honestly, I've never seen it as good as this, ever. And so that's a case where very little goes in, a lot comes out. The challenge in something like biology, for example, is, what are you trying to explain? For example, in self-reproduction, what are you trying to explain? What is the phenomenon you're trying to explain? And is it the particular details of, let's say, life on Earth and how it reproduces itself? And how far do you get in sort of assuming all those details, and then what do you really get out of it? I was so happens I had agreed to go because I've been working on biology, and I particularly recently made a sort of surprising piece of progress in understanding the foundations of biological evolution. I realized that I agreed to go to some conference about biological evolution and the foundations of it in a few weeks. And I was looking back at my archives, and I realized I went to such a conference. I will have been almost exactly 40 years since I was last at a biological evolution conference. And the last one I was at was kind of the kind of in the 1980s, in 1984, and was sort of featured kind of most of the leading lights of thinking about that at that time. Sadly, most of those people are dead now. But I think I might be one of the few survivors from that conference. But in any case, the thing that's sort of interesting, that was a period when people were it was the beginning of when people were very keen on doing computational models, but not a lot was learned. The thing I was interested in doing computational models of biological evolution at that time, and I didn't get very far with it. Actually, I made a mistake, because in the end, just a few months ago, I took pretty much exactly the model that I had had in 1985 or so, and just pushed it a lot harder, and discovered that, yes, you can actually see biological evolution, or the analog of it, in this incredibly simple model. And you can see all sorts of very interesting phenomena, which I happen to be continuing to look at right now, from these incredibly simple models that are just based on these very simple cellular automaton-like things with tiny rules. I mean, not like John von Neumann's, 26,000 cells and 28 states and, thousands of different cases in the rule. We're talking about something with like 20 cases in its rule, and looking at how that can adapt and so on. So it's that's a case where it's, well, like I was just looking at phenomena like, oh, let's see, what was I looking at? I was looking at phenomena like, as you change the fitness function, as you change what it is that causes you as an organism to succeed, to what extent do you retain a memory of sort of previous fitness functions in in what happens sort of later on, so to speak. So in other words, if your species went through a near extinction event where it was really important that you be able to run fast, and then later on, it doesn't matter whether you can run fast, how quickly does the memory of that sort of that die out? That was one thing I was looking at. I was just looking at something else, which is one of the things that's true about kind of a lot of traits that we have is that many genes contribute to them, like human height. Presumably, many genes contribute. And the end result is that we have a normal distribution, Gaussian distribution of human heights, roughly. And the question is, can you see that phenomenon? Can you see multigenic traits? Can you see them even in these very minimal models? And I was just starting to look at that. And it's sort of interesting to see the transition from things which are like eye color, where there are a very small number of bits effectively in the genome that affect that, to things where there are large numbers that contribute. And I was trying to understand that, see how that works. Other things, a lot of things one can look at. I mean, a lot of things about sort of the what happens when you perturb an organism, kind of the foundational question of medicine. If you have an organism that has been evolved to operate in a particular way and you poke it in some way, what can happen? What are the different kinds of diseases that can result? What are the kind of genetic diseases? What are the different predispositions to things, to results of poking working differently depending on the genome of the organism? These are all things that in this very minimal model one can start to explore. One can also look at self-reproduction. One can ask questions like, what does it take what's the minimal system that has certain attributes of self-reproduction? I actually looked at that a few weeks ago, and some kind of interesting results. I'm not happy with them yet. And it's sort of a question of whether it's just reproducing exactly what you sort of put in, or whether it does what biology often does, which is it has a certain robustness, where even if, you can still have kids, even if your genome is a bit different, so to speak. And you'll pass on those changes of your genome to your kids and so on. So let's see, there's a question here. Oh boy, many questions. Well, 5 is asking, wouldn't chaos theory be an example of a computational case, coming back to difference in computational and mathematical models? Actually, that's sort of a messy case, because chaos theory is all about sensitive dependence on initial conditions. You might think, well, a typical example is if you just at every step, you multiply a number by 10 and you look only at the fractional part. So you look only at the things to the right of the decimal place. Well, if you keep doing that, you keep on multiplying by 10, every step you're going to kind of excavate another digit from the number. So if your number was 0.12345 or something, you will, first of all, you'll see a 1 show up in the ones column, then a 2, then a 3, then a 4. Eventually you'll get to the 5, and then what happens next? Well, if you don't know more digits, you don't know what's going to come next. And sort of the big idea of chaos theory is that if you are specifying the initial condition, you have to specify it incredibly precisely to know what's going to come next. And then there's kind of a bit of a sleight of hand, because in mathematics, the idea of real numbers, where sort of all these different possible numbers arranged between 0 and 1, for example, there's an infinite number of numbers between 0 and 1 with all these different infinite digit sequences. And in sort of traditional mathematics, kind of all those numbers are sort of equally valid numbers. And so you can just put in any of those numbers. And once you put in one of those numbers, then in a sense, the digits of that number are random, because most numbers won't have any regularity in those digits. So as you keep excavating digits, you'll see randomness. I think it's I think it's not a source of randomness that's really of much interest in almost every physical situation. I mean, there are some in celestial mechanics where you have very precise sort of arrangement of planets and so on, where you do get to excavate, 15 digits or something like this. But in most cases, you get to excavate 3 digits. And everything beyond that is not really governed by those same kinds of rules. So, chaos theory, which was originated in the beginning of the 20th century, was actually came out of celestial mechanics and thinking about those kinds of things. I think it kind of got a big play in the 80s. I think it's really not the source of pretty much anything in what we see. Usually what happens is, so for example, a very, very typical case was what Ed Lorenz did in 1963, looking at sort of equations for the weather. Well, they weren't really equations for the weather. They are a sort of truncation of those equations. The full equations in the way that he was setting it up would be an infinite set of equations. He just truncated it to 3 equations. And then he said, okay, with those 3 equations, as you change the initial conditions just a tiny bit on those equations, but you run the math equations, then you will get sort of this divergence of trajectories. The thing is, when you actually take the infinite collection of equations that describe actual fluids, viscosity, kind of the friction of fluids, basically damps out any of that effect. So the effect that Ed Lorenz saw of sort of chaos in the so-called Lorenz equations, sort of the truncated equations of fluid dynamics, that just doesn't show up in actual fluid dynamics in the same way, except in cases where you are right on a knife edge at a bifurcation point where you could go either this way or that way, and just a tiny push makes you go one way or the other. So, you know, the quintessential, the butterfly that does or doesn't flap its wings, you know, sort of 99.999999999, many nines % of all butterflies, their wing flaps will have no consequence whatsoever. It is just that microscopic possibility that you're right on this knife edge, which is incredibly, incredibly rare, then it could have an effect. But it's only going to have a small, it's not going to be that this idea that you're sort of routinely excavating all these digits, I just think is a wrong idea. I mean, you know, we get to see some of these things in sort of games of chance. You flip a coin. Which way is the coin going to land? Well, once the coin is spinning in the air, you could solve its equations of motion kind of in a math-like way, and you just say, I know which way it's going to come up heads. I know what its equations of motion are. I know it's going to come up heads. There's no ambiguity about that. The place where the randomness comes in is when you do that flip of your thumb or whatever it is, your muscles are not controlled enough that you can know whether it will be, you know, whether it's precisely velocity 0.11 or 0.12 or whatever else. And because you're flipping around in the air a bunch of times, you're essentially cutting out, you know, if it's velocity 0.11, then it will end up as heads. If it's 0.12, it will end up with tails, just because a slight change in velocity will cause you to flip one more time in the air, which will land you up on a different side. And so the randomness is coming from the fact that you don't know exactly, you can't control your muscles well enough to know exactly how hard you're going to flip it. Well, maybe some people can control their muscles well enough, and then they can do all kinds of magic tricks based on that idea. But that's sort of the typical case of that, and it's a rather thin phenomenon. I think it's been a phenomenon that it's nice because there is mathematics that can be done on it. You can really analyze what happens in a bunch of cases. It's not so interesting for the reality of what happens in the world. I mean, I think one of the things that I pointed out first in the early 1980s is that there's a lot more cases where simple rules generate apparent randomness in a completely determined way. There's no excavating digits or anything like that. It's like digits of, you know, like my Rule 30 cellular automaton does this. Just a simple rule. You started off, the pattern it grows is really complicated. You could also do that if you were computing digits of pi, you're computing the primes, you're computing a lot of these kinds of things. There's lots of randomness, even though the algorithm by which you produce those things is quite simple and completely determined. Okay, maybe one more. I see many interesting questions here. I always enjoy these live streams because people ask such interesting things here, and I get to think about lots of different kinds of things. I will say, by the way, just coming back to the self-reproduction question, one of the reasons I sort of got interested in that recently is that as we think about kind of observers, and we think about how observers kind of, you know, we have laws of physics of the kind we do because we're observers of the kind we are. One of the things that's a little bit weird is, imagine there was only one observer. There was only one of us. There's only one human observer. It would be a very strange situation. We wouldn't have a need to, or a way to, package up our thoughts as language, communicate them, and so on. It will be just that one internal thing that's going on. And the reason that there are lots of us who are sort of similar enough that we can communicate is basically self-reproduction. If it wasn't for that, there'd be no reason to have lots of similar humans. Well, maybe there would be if being a human was an inevitable, sort of, in a sense, mathematical consequence of the structure of the universe. But absent that, these sort of particulars seem to be driven by self-reproduction. And so I was trying to understand that at a foundational level so that I could say more things about what kind of observers we are, or we have to be. And because I have this guess that many features, I already know that some major features of physics are a consequence of us being observers of the kind we are, us being computationally bounded, us believing that we are persistent in time. I already know that those features have the consequence that we have to observe the physical world to have certain laws that we know it has. Well, I'm trying to understand more about what we have to be like as observers to be sort of observers even roughly like us. And self-reproduction is one of the pieces in that story. Let's see. I'm seeing from Jamie here, how do we prepare for the risk of bots and worms invading everyday life as we become more dependent on technology? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, at the point where we're all wearing augmented reality glasses and it's like, and there's spam everywhere. Everywhere we look, there's some weird piece of spam that's advertising some weird thing or whatever else. And as our sensory system becomes more, as we're dealing with layers of essentially software or automation or AI or whatever in even our sort of sensory systems, we are more at the risk of things being sort of injected that way. I mean, insofar as we're looking at screens a lot of the time, or we're reading our email or something like this, those are places where sort of stuff we don't want can be injected. Of course, it can be injected into the real world as well. We can have all kinds of ugly, things that were sort of terrible urban architecture injected into our world in the physical world as well. But it becomes a more lightweight thing to do that in the virtual world. And the question is sort of, how does that play out? I think the fundamental problem, so, what computer security is kind of the thing that is sort of the issue in all of this. And in a sense, what is the fundamental mission of computer security? It's to have computers do the things we want them to do and not the things we don't want them to do. And it can be difficult to define what are the things we want computers to do. If you have some very smart, router, for example, or firewall, that's very cleverly figuring out, oh, no, you shouldn't do this or that. If you are connecting to this kind of site that is a pig butchering site or something, that scam site or something like this, oh, no, you shouldn't do that. Even if you might be a researcher studying those things, and then it's like, oops, those things don't exist because my firewall tells me they don't exist. And then you're very confused. But in any case, as the things that we deal with sort of get smarter and smarter, it's more and more complicated to say what we want to have happen versus what we don't want to have happen. And by the way, another thing is it's kind of like with machinery that's understandable and not. There was a time when, something like a firewall, let's say, was kind of set up in such a way that, oh yeah, let through these packets, but not these packets or whatever else. And it's, there are definite rules that you can easily see defined. But then as soon as it gets to be smarter, it gets to be the case that one sort of is pouring in computational irreducibility. One's letting it do more computation, but that means that you can't know what it's going to do. And so it might do something very clever, but it might have some unexpected consequence where it does something very stupid. And that's sort of a big trade-off that one has. Does one want it to be able to do smart things? If yes, then it will do things one doesn't expect. And some of those things may be things one doesn't want. And so I think this question of sort of defining the rules for what we want to have happen versus not, in a sense, once we've defined those rules, then it's a matter of kind of being clever about computer security to be able to implement those rules. But it becomes essentially impossible when some of the things that we are trying to set up rules for are things that show computational irreducibility, because we just don't know how to build the box that lets it be smart but also prevents it from doing certain kinds of things. Now, you might say, well, let's at least make it never touch my bank account, let's say. Well, that's fine until the moment when you actually want some automation because you want to be automatically rebalancing something or doing some trades automatically if this or that happens. And then, well, actually, I do want my AI to be able to be connected to those things. And then you get to the situation where it's like, yes, you have a bunch of screens where you press OK, where it has this big thing saying, by the way, your AI may in principle be able to sell your house out from under you. And that's somewhere in the fine print because that's something that in principle in some corner could happen. But so, I think it's a this whole question of how you get computational systems to do the things you want and not the things you don't want is a difficult question. And one of the things that I think is inevitable is that increasingly there's sort of an ecosystem, a world of computational systems just interacting with each other, where we are, and it probably is already the case, that in fact, I worked this out recently, certainly the total amount of sort of cycles going on in the world, there's more of that happening in computers than there is in brains at this point. And I think the thing that there's sort of this whole civilization that's developing in the civilization of the AIs, and we are sort of merely living on the periphery of that civilization. And there's sort of a question of how do we deal with that? Do we sort of build barriers for ourselves against the sort of the AIs, or do we try to control the AIs to the point where they'll always do the right thing, whatever that might be? These are pretty complicated questions, and I think I feel like I haven't gotten to the bottom of how that should work. And I think there are sort of societal issues about the choice between having systems be able to be as smart as possible versus having systems be as controlled as possible. And I think it is a feature of if you have a computer system that's defined in just this way, and just doing the things that it's defined to do are things that are considered are useful to you or what you want, you can potentially lock it down to do just those things. But if you say, oh, and by the way, do a smart thing in this other case, then you're opening a door that's going to be very hard to control. All right, I think I have to go back to my day job here. And yeah, lots of interesting questions. I look forward to talking about them another time. Thanks for joining me here. Thanks for asking lots of interesting questions. Thanks for, I was having a difficult day pushing to get our new product out. And I always find chatting with you guys relaxing and interesting. So thank you for providing me with that opportunity. Bye for now.